Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Jay Bailey Radio Hour, Jay Bailey Podcast, brought to you live on Facebook on this wonderful, dreary Saturday morning here in East Tennessee. It's kind of depressing out. I just went to the bank and asked the teller about a fee that the bank keeps taking out. So I keep getting an $8 fee taken out every month, and it just says monthly fee. It doesn't say anything else. It doesn't say what it is, why it's a fee, this and that, da da da. So I went down and I asked about it, and I was asked to wait. And then I finally, after waiting about 15 minutes, I sat down with a woman, and I could not get her to admit that they had essentially never told me about the fee, when I got the bank account. Just couldn't get her to admit that. It was like talking to a lawyer, you know. Um, every response that she had was uh, a remembrance or just a line from a script. It was like talking to a robot. Everything that I asked about was already um, written for her. So her responses were almost written for her. And basically she told me, well, if you haven't gotten a direct deposit in a certain amount of time, like if you go a couple of weeks without income coming in, then we will start taking monthly fees out. And I asked for what? And she said, well, if you don't have 10 monthly swipes, then we take $8 out. And so I said, so basically you're taking money from people who are not spending their money. And I couldn't get her to say yes. I tried and I tried and I tried. I couldn't get her to say yes, we are taking money from people who have no money. So basically, if you're not spending your money, then they take a fee out of your account. But if you're spending your money, if you have more than 10 swipes a month, if you are not, if you are working and you're getting money deposited into your account, then they leave you alone. But if you're not, and you're not spending your money, then they take the $8 fee. So, and I basically said, so if you're not spending your money, then, and you're doing what you're supposed to do, saving, then you take the money. You take out the $8 fee. But if you are spending your money and you are not saving your money, then they take from you. So basically, it's kicking you when you're down. So if you're not working and you're not spending money, they take from you. But if you're spending money and you're working, then they leave you alone. That's basically what it is. And so I tried to simplify it for her, and she basically didn't want to hear it. And she didn't want to admit it, but that's essentially what's going on. But getting these people to admit what they're doing is impossible. Not to mention that they have basically all the power, you know. So there's that. And so the best thing that we can do, since we are on the verge, we are on the cusp of revolution, is to educate ourselves, It will probably be my generation who will have to fix things. The previous generation is the one who um, started the mess that we're in. So it's going to be up to us to fix things. And the best way to do so is to educate yourself, because in this environment, there are two people. There are predators and there are prey. And so you do not want to be prey, okay? And the predators are the CEOs, the big bankers, the top people. What they do is they prey on the weak. They prey on the gullible. They prey on the poor. They prey on the uneducated. And so it is a predator prey environment. It is a predator and prey mentality. You can call it predator and prey. You can call it educated, non-educated. It's basically the same thing. So you can call it whatever you like, but that is the way it is. And it's always been that way. But before we had a safety valve, we had a government that was actually run by the people and not run by the corporations. And so before, we still had a somewhat sane government that many of the people in the government tried to do what was morally right, they remembered where they came from. So the Constitution was um, engulfed in them. The Constitution and that type of belief system was ingrained in them when they were real young, because their parents taught them what America was, what America escaped, what the founding fathers wanted for everybody. And so that was still ingrained in them. And it was ingrained in them by their parents. And a lot of them humble beginnings. And so when you have humble beginnings, it's ingrained in you. But when you don't have humble beginnings, when you have been told that you are special your whole life and you have no idea what it's like to live another type of life, when you have no empathy for the poor, when you have no empathy for the struggle, then you cannot sympathize with the vast majority of people. And so these are the people that we have in government. These are the people who we have at the top. They have no way to empathize. They don't have humble beginnings. Okay, they were, many of them, not all of them, but many of the people that we have today, you know, who are doing such are second and third generation rich. So their parents were wealthy. They went to the top schools. They had top education. That's the environment that they grew up in. And so they have no way of empathizing, and that's the problem with second and third generation. Whereas before, the first generation, most of them had humble beginnings. Most of them had a way to empathize with the working class. And so it was ingrained in them, and the Constitution was ingrained in them. And so, they had a certain empathy. They had humble beginnings. Therefore, that carved out their morality. And so that defined them as a human being, that defined their belief system. And so when they have a definition of who they are, that gets reflected outward to everybody that they associate with. And so that is what I believe is truly missing today. We don't have humble beginnings anymore. We have second and third generation people who, have no way to empathize with the vast majority of people. If you go to California, there are literally two Californias. There are the Democrats who are made up of the upper middle class or the rich and the poor. So the Democratic Party, which is bizarre, but the Democratic Party are mainly composed of the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor, whereas the middle class are now mainly Republican. And so you have two Californians. You have the intellectual class, you have the elite, who are mainly Democrats, and then you have the extremely poor, the welfare recipients, who are basically voting, Democrat because the system gives them things. So the people who run California are Democrats, and that's why they want the migrants coming in, because they want them to vote for them, because they know the middle class will never vote them in. The middle class actually is leaving California because they are being squeezed. And there's all these fees being added on. There's all these fees being added on to their utility bill, to their property tax. And so they're leaving California in droves and moving to states like Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, because it's cheaper. There's not as much property tax. And so there are really two Californians. There are the rich. There are the Democrats, who are the rich and the poor. And then there are the middle class, who are mainly Republican, because they have to be. They have to be. And so they're leaving California in droves, because California is the most mismanaged state in the union. If you go to like Fresno, see, many of the rich Democrats, the wealthy elite, they live in Palo Alto. They live in some of the others, Palo Alto, and then you have Fresno, which is like Crime City. So there are really two Californias. And the people from Palo Alto, the people from Thousand Oaks, they are sheltered, from the rest of the world. They are insulated, and they only speak to people who are like them. And so they're insulated. They don't see what goes on down the road in Fresno, in all these other towns where there are literally pit bulls and Rottweilers running free and people living in trailers. And if you go to San Francisco, there's literally people sleeping on the street. That's how bad it is. There's people defecating on the street. The people in Palo Alto and the surrounding counties, I can't think of the names right now, but Palo Alto is one of them. They don't see what really goes on in Fresno, right? They don't see what really goes on in San Francisco because they're insulated. So you have extreme income inequality. And it's just a really bizarre system. And, they want to argue about postmodernism, but really what it is it's pre-modernism, modernism. Because kind of like it was in the Middle Ages, you had the kings and the queen class, the aristocrats who lived in the castles, and then everybody else was just a peasant. That's kind of what's happening to California. You have the upper class, the aristocrats, who live in places like Palo Alto in the surrounding counties. And then you have the rest, the peasants, who live in places like Fresno and Oakland and, you know, um, even in tents. I mean, it's so bad there's people living in tents downtown San Francisco. And the city is so bankrupt they can't afford to house these people. They're basically worse than peasants, because in the Middle Ages, the peasants at least had some type of shelter. They at least had somewhat of a place to live. It may have been run down, but they at least had shelter. These people don't even have shelter, you know. So the Democrats, it's bizarre to me that the Democrats act like they care about the poor when the vast majority of Democrats in the United States live in California and have been in power in California for decades. And, that's what's happening. And so that is why you see this migrant caravan that's coming in to invade California, is because the elite, they cannot empathize with the middle class. They have no empathy. They don't know what it's like to live downtown Fresno. They don't know what it's like because they don't go there. Okay? They have no way of empathizing. And so they have this bizarre belief system in which their own belief system is not practical for the majority of people, but they have the wealth, they have the power, they have the money to protect them. And so their own ideology doesn't have actual ramifications in their everyday life because they have the money, they have the power, they have the wealth to believe a certain way. Whereas if they didn't have the money, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the wealth, then their ideology would have huge ramifications. So it's good to say, yes, everybody should be able to come here. I believe in open borders. I believe um, in the welfare state. I believe in abortion. I believe all this, da 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 da, because that doesn't affect them. So illegal immigration, having open borders, and anybody coming here, that doesn't actually affect them because they have the wealth to insulate themselves, and they live in places like Palo Alto. You know, they live in those towns because, and they have huge walls, by the way, around their house, huge walls in their community. So they are sheltered. They don't see what goes on in places like Fresno. So their ideology, and it's strange because the people who are coming here, the illegal immigrants, they are voting Democrat because they want something. They want goodies. And so it's this bizarre master slave type relationship where the wealthy and the poor vote Democrat, but yet the middle class cannot afford to vote Democrat. They have to vote Republican because the middle classes are the ones who are being squeezed. Okay. You can say that you can say, okay, but the rich pay more in taxes. Okay, but if you have 20 apples and you pay 4 apples in taxes, that leaves you with 16 apples. Or you have 3 apples and you pay 1 apple in taxes. You can say, yeah, the rich pay more in taxes, but the rich make 20 apples a day. So they pay 3 apples. Yeah, they pay more in taxes, but they also make 20 apples a day. You know, So that argument doesn't really work. But let me get to the point. Let me cut to the chase. You know, I think we are at a teetering point in America where the whole system is teetering on collapse. The government is paralyzed. The people are just, they don't trust their government anymore. It is impossible to vote against the corporate interest, the corporate machine. Both parties have become completely corrupt. It costs so much money to run for office nowadays. There's no way that a regular person could ever run for office. And that is what our founding fathers were afraid of, you know. So they've leached on, they've found their way to go around the Constitution. They have found a really good way. And that is what you're seeing now. You're seeing paralysis. The government is not working anymore because on one side, you have the people, the majority, right, of people who are in the middle, by the way. The majority of voters are in the middle. You have the majority on one side, and you have the corporate power, the corporate interests, the big banks on this side. So every politician has to look their constituents in the eye and say, yes, okay, we will do that. We will do that. But on the other side, they have corporate interests, and that's who they really work for. And so the corporate interest is really who they take their orders from. So they can't do what they say. So you have this paralysis in government. And so the only thing that's left are social issues. Divide and conquer, right? And there's nobody really in government who is looking out for the people, you know. And that is why I want to get to who was Teddy Roosevelt. Because Teddy Roosevelt, I think, doesn't get as much credit as he should. But we are in need of a Teddy Roosevelt currently. We need a Teddy Roosevelt. Because if you look back at history and who was responsible for breaking up the big monopolies in the early 20th century, which is happening again in the early 21st century, the person responsible for breaking up the monopolies was Teddy Roosevelt. Okay? So let's go ahead and look and see who was Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt was an American statesman. He was a writer. He served as the Assistant Secretary to the United States Navy. He became president after William McKinley's assassination. He was William McKinley's vice president. So he wasn't actually elected the first time. And he was the guy who was considered progressive. Now, this is the interesting thing. Was Teddy Roosevelt in his day was a progressive, okay? And he hated the big corporations. He hated the monopolies that were going on. The J.P. Morgans, the Andrew Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, right? They all had huge monopolies. And, you know, it was just impossible. It was impossible to vote against them. You know, you couldn't. They had so much power. The monopolies had so much power in the early 20th century. It was impossible just to go against them. I mean, you know, it was considered the Gilded Age. That's what they call it, the Gilded Age. And so uh, that is what is happening today now, the 21st century, is we are kind of going back into a Gilded Age where extreme income inequality is inevitable. Nobody talks about it. There's no politician out there talking about it. All you hear is this constant reel of the war on drugs, the Trump, right? So everything bad that happens is Trump, Trump, Trump. It's like a continuous reel, right? And I mean, there's just it's the same thing: sexual harassment, Trump, the war on drugs, which they call the opioid crisis now. So now it has a new name. The war on drugs has a new name. They call it the opioid crisis, but it's just the same thing. It's the war on drugs. It's been going on since the 20s, you know, when they outlawed alcohol. But there's nothing about income inequality. There's nothing about mass incarceration. There's nothing about falling wages. There's nothing about the cost of living. There's nothing about a loss of skilled trades. There's nothing about the loss of the family, the breakup of the family. There's nothing about that. You don't hear about that in the news. It's the same thing, day in and day out. So there is nobody in government who is willing to step up about the average problems that are happening for the majority of people. There's nobody in TV, there's nobody in the press, there's nobody in the government who are talking about what is the problems with the majority of people. And that's who Teddy Roosevelt was. He was a trust buster in the time that society was in desperate need of a trust buster. He was that angel. He was that saving grace, right? Who came in. I mean, if it wasn't for Teddy Roosevelt, who doesn't get as much credit, I think, as he should, you know, we would probably never had the most prosperous generation, the baby boomer generation. We probably would have not had that, because it would have been all these monopolies, and there would have been no way to there would have been no vibrant middle class, you know, because the government would have been strictly working for the corporations. The people would have got squeezed out, and you would have had what had happened in the past. You would have had something like the Middle Ages, in which the aristocrats, the kings and queens, lived on the coasts, lived in their castles, and the rest were just wards of the state. The rest of the people were just peasants. You would have had that continuation throughout history. You would have had that in the 40s and 50s. Not the most prosperous generation ever to exist, which was the baby boomers, and who managed to squander it and leave their children 20 trillion in debt, you know. So there's that. Okay. So he was really a revolutionary, really. But see, he was considered progressive because he wanted to break up the monopolies. And that is what is missing. And that's why the Democrats suck. That's why nobody trusts the Democrats. because they're not talking about real issues. It's just, it's strange to me that the Democrats don't talk about real issues. The only thing the Democrats talk about are race, race, race. They don't actually talk about how to solve the problems. You know, that's what's amazing to me. That's why the Republicans got reelected, because the middle class didn't trust all this division that the Democrats have given us. They don't want that. You know, America's long tired of that. And so the middle class has almost exclusively turned Republican, which is different. The Republicans in the 60s were mainly the rich, but now that's flipped around. The Democrats mainly today are either extremely wealthy or poor. The middle class has mainly turned Republican. So it's just bizarre. But Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. He understood the monopolies that they had, that the guys like Vanderbilt and Morgan and Carnegie had. And he said, no, you guys are way too powerful. We need to split you guys up. And so Roosevelt really, really did a lot to shape the rest of the 20th century. He really did. He passed laws breaking up the big banks, breaking up the railroad industry, breaking up the oil industry, the steel industry. He was responsible for the rise of unions, for the workers' rights movement, right? That's missing now. The unions are practically destroyed. And you have all these temp jobs appearing, right? It's because nobody in the Democrat Party are looking out for the workers. They're not looking out for the regular people. They're just they are the corporate machine. They are part of that 1%. And so the Democrats really have betrayed their original constituents. They've betrayed the workers. That's what's so sad. And what they do now is they use demographics, because they understand demographics are important to keeping them in power. That's why they always circle around this race crap. Race, race, race. Instead of just looking at people as Americans, they divide people into demographics, and they tell you, hey, you need to vote for us because the guy over there is racist. The guy over there is a racist, so you need to vote for us. Instead of saying, hey, I understand you guys are poor. We need jobs. And if you had jobs, if you had money, then you would have some type of life. You maybe have some type of family. They don't say that. If there was more opportunity, you guys might be able to work yourself out of poverty, American poverty. True poverty doesn't exist in America. Just so you guys understand, most poor have running water. Most poor, American poor, have electricity, or access to electricity, access to running water. Now, some don't, but we are seeing that in California. We are seeing all these homeless people who don't have access to running water, don't have access to electricity. I mean, it's just that's where we're at. So the Democrats betrayed, and so and they're asking us to vote for them again. You know, without no solutions. They're not talking about the real issues: falling wages, rise of the state, income inequality, mass incarceration, failing schools, failing education, the rise of college or the cost of college that's way, way expensive. They're not addressing any of these issues. So why should we vote for them? That's my question. I'd rather vote for a chimp. If you put a chimp on a poster and said, vote for this person or vote for a chimp, you know, I would probably vote for the chimp, you know. Probably have more chance with a chimp than putting these people in office again, you know, or just select somebody at random. Some guy that's, I don't know, electrician or, you know, is a plumber or something. Just some random guy in the middle of the country, Nebraska somewhere. Just pick him out of a hat and say, okay, you're going to be president. I would feel more secure knowing that there's some guy, just a regular guy out there, makes 40,000 a year, if that, is a plumber, works with his hands. Let's make him president. They would probably be more trusting than these people we got now, who are not talking about any of the issues that really is affecting the country. I mean, it really is sad. So, we are in desperate need of a Teddy Roosevelt. And fake Democrats, fake so-called progressives are everywhere. But the progressive is just a label. They're not true progressives in the historian sense. They are not. Because they don't know the issues. They don't know how to fix anything. The country is mainly comprised of the rich and the poor, who are Democrats, and the middle class, who has slowly been disappearing for decades, are comprised of Republicans. Who would have thought the Republicans would turn out to be aligned with the middle class? And who would have thought that so-called progressives, the so-called Democrats, would really be communist? So, I'm going to end on that note. Just a thought about the environment we are living in, where your wallet determines who you vote for. That is dangerous. And who the media, who had record profits last year, refused to address the true issues in the name of profit, in the name of self-enrichment. Nobody is there to stand up for the regular people. There's nobody there like Teddy Roosevelt.